that and reduce our deficit. Madam President, I yield to my friend and colleague from Vermont, Senator Sanders.
I thank my
senator from Vermont.
I thank my friendly senator from Illinois. And before I begin, I wanted, on behalf of Senator Merkley, to ask unanimous consent for floor privileges for the balance of the day for Maya Arietta Walden.
Without objection, so ordered.
I appreciate very much the remarks of the senator from Illinois, and I wanted to amplify on them just a little bit. But before I do, I wanted to mention something that we don't talk about enough here on the floor of the Senate. You know, Madam President, in New England, and I'm sure in Minnesota, we have a lot of sports fans. And when you're interested in baseball or basketball or football or hockey, whatever, the key question that everyone always asks is who wins and who loses? Who wins and who loses? Well, I think it is appropriate that in terms of the economy, as it currently stands, we should also ask that simple question, who's winning and who's losing? And let me discuss that for one moment before I get into deficit reduction. Simple reality is, and we don't talk about it almost at all here on the floor of the Senate, media doesn't talk about it terribly much, but the reality is that we have the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth, and more income and wealth inequality in this country than at any time since the 1920s, late 1920s. Today, Madam President, the wealthiest 400 people own more wealth than the bottom half of America, about 150 million people. You could squeeze 400 people into this room, and if they were the wealthiest people in America, they would own more wealth than the bottom half of America. A report just came across my desk yesterday, which I want to share with you and with the American people. And this is really quite incredible and kind of tells us where we are moving as a nation. And that is that today, the Walton family of Walmart fame, the folks who own Walmart, one family now owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of America. One family owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of America. Madam President, today, the top 1% owns 40% of the wealth of the country. I think a lot of people are very surprised by that number. Top 1% owns 40% of the wealth of America. But what people would be far more shocked at is if you ask them how much the bottom 60% of the American people own. And I have done this in Vermont. I've asked people, and they say, well, 10%, 20%. The answer is less than 2%. Top 1% owns 40% of the wealth of America. The bottom 60% owns less than 2%. The bottom 40% of America owns 0.3%. Less than one family, the Walton family, own. Now, why is that important? It's important because it tells us, I think, from both a moral and economic perspective, the direction that we have got to move in terms of deficit reduction. Now, I find it a little bit amusing that some of my Republican friends come to the floor of the Senate and say, we are deficit hawks. We've got to cut. We're worried about our kids. We're worried about our grandchildren. We're worried about borrowing money for China. They got a whole set of talking points. They're worried about the deficit. I'm worried about the deficit. Every American should be worried about the deficit. But I have a question to ask some of my Republican friends who today are great deficit hawks. And that is, where were they a few years ago? I voted against the war in Iraq for a number of reasons, not the least of which is it wasn't paid for. War in Afghanistan wasn't paid for. And I find it kind of interesting that former President Bush, a great deficit hawk, All my Republican friends, great deficit hawks, they went not just to one war, they went into 2 wars, Madam President, and you know what? It just slipped their mind. They forgot to pay for it. You know, we all have slips of memory. Go to the grocery store, you forget to buy the container of milk your wife wanted you to buy. It just slipped their mind. They were so busy talking about the deficit that they went into 2 wars, cost trillions of dollars, and forgot to pay for it. And today, they have noticed, it has come to their attention that there is a deficit. I voted against the war in Iraq. I'm not so sure that many of them did. Second issue. Madam President, if you go on a shopping spree or a gambling spree or whatever it may be, and you spend a lot of money, give away a lot of money, you have less money. Our Republican friends fought for and created huge tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country. Hundreds and hundreds of billions of tax breaks, dollars in tax breaks, went to the top 1%, went to the top 2%. So our deficit hawk friends who come down here every day to tell us how concerned they are went into 2 wars that they forgot to pay for, and for the first time in American history, they actually gave tax breaks to the very rich while they were at war. Furthermore, one of the major problems that our country is facing now in terms of the deficit, and Senator Durbin touched on it, is that because of the recession, which was caused by the greed and recklessness and illegal behavior of Wall Street, and many of my Republican friends and some Democrats told us a while back when I was in the House how important it was to deregulate Wall Street, to allow the large commercial banks to merge with the investor banks, to merge with the insurance companies, and just get the government off the backs of these honorable people on Wall Street who are looking out for the American people. Well, it turned out, of course, they're a bunch of crooks. We deregulated them, and they did what many of us thought that they would do. They began exchanging in incredibly complicated financial transactions, which took this country to the verge of an international financial collapse. And our friends on Wall Street needed their welfare payment from the middle class of America, $700-some billion of welfare payments for Wall Street to bail them out, and the Fed provided $16 trillion in low-interest loans on a revolving loan basis. But in the midst of all of that, Madam President, what ended up happening is that revenue is now down to 15.8% of GDP, which is the lowest amount of revenue per GDP that we have seen in a very, very, very long time. So you go into 2 wars, you don't pay for them, give tax breaks to billionaires, you deregulate Wall Street, they cause a recession, revenue declines as a percentage of GDP, and you know what? You got a serious deficit crisis, which is where we are right now. $16 trillion national debt. I think it's a $1.2 trillion a year deficit. Serious situation. How do we deal with it? Everybody here recognizes it's a problem. We don't want the younger generation to have to pick this national debt up. How do we deal with it? Well, my Republican friends have a great idea. Let's see, we went to 2 wars, didn't pay for it, tax breaks for the rich, deregulated Wall Street, a recession. Oh, I know how we could deal with the deficit. Let's cut Social Security. That's a good idea. After all, we only have 50-some-odd million people on Social Security. Why don't we come up with a chained CPI? Now, nobody outside of Capitol Hill knows what a chained CPI is. And if any senior citizen, somebody on Social Security, is watching this, please don't laugh. But I do want to tell you what a chained CPI is. You'll think I'm not telling you the truth. Check it out. I am. Yes, there are people here in the Senate and in the House who think your COLAs have been too large, that the formula which determined COLAs, cost of living allowance increases for seniors, has been too generous. And now what you're saying is, what is this guy talking about? How could it be too